Welcome to Thelma Podcast Life Story channel. This is the second part of the life story of Jean Duncan, who was brought up in Glasgow. In this episode we hear about leaving school at 14 and the boredom of working at the bookbinders, and then going to catering college to learn how to cook for 4 people and the reality of being a school cook and making 3,000 spam fritters in a morning and 3,000 beef olives in an afternoon. There's more memories of the crowded family house and of life in the late 1960s and early 70s.
When I was a young teenager, 14 and 15, as I said, my father insisted I left school when I was 14. When you left, the school was finished in the June, and that was the school holidays. I would have been 15 in September. And one of his friends' daughter worked in Collins, the bookbinders, and she was on what they call piecework. So the more they did, the more money they got. So he said, "There's a job for you." And he insisted I went to Collins the bookbinder. I used to read the books rather than I'd get the books and I'd be reading them. But my job was so mundane. There would be rows upon rows of 6 girls sitting behind what looked like sewing machines. And what they did was they were sewing. In those days, you would sew the books together. And then the men would take it away and they would bind the books. And so my job, believe it or not, was a pair of scissors, walking in between these 6 girls, backwards and forwards, and cutting where the book ended. And so they measured, and you would cut and measure and cut all day. And I hated it.
I'm not surprised.
And there was nothing that was stimulating. And when the girls who were a lot older than me, and they were all, boys and drink and parties, and I was quite young, and when it came to lunchtime, there would be a buzzer went, and you left to go and get your lunch. And then the buzzer would sound to come back, and very often I was at the end of the queue, and I never got any lunch. So then I figured out my mother would make me a sandwich, and I would sit in the factory area, and there was rows and rows of these girls. I would sit there and read the books. And so I didn't last very long at it. I hated it. And that brings my grandmother, my mother's stepmother. She worked in a dinner school near her home. In fact, she worked in Winterlaw, the school I went to. She was what they call a servant lady, because during the war, before the war, children went home for a meal. And that was the tradition. And during the war, when the men was at war and the women were in the factories or whatever, they decided to have school dinners. And the school dinners was widows and spinsters. Mm-hmm. And they weren't trained to cook properly. All they had was big pots of soup, big pots for custards. That's where you get the lumpy custard from. And so the result of all of that was my grandmother, who was a widow, she would be working and serving meals. And she said to me out of the blue one day, "There's a lady who took over the Glasgow school meals who wants to train young women, to train them as proper cooks, who then will go out into the kitchens and teach the women to cook." And it was a fabulous idea, and I thought, school holidays, I got all my school holidays.
Yeah, good thinking.
Good job.
Yeah.
And so she talked me into becoming a school dinner lady. And so at the age of 15, I became a school dinner lady. I was well trained. I went to 2 different colleges, one for 6 months, which was the mince and tatties and custard and how to do it properly, how to peel a potato, these type of things. There's a chicken with the feathers, pluck the chicken, and so that was how you learned from scratch. I went there for 6 months, but I also then get sent out to kitchens, and that's where the story begins, because then I get sent 1 day a week to Langside College in Glasgow, and I was in a class with 18 boys, and they all worked in top hotels, and they were all chefs. And women in those days weren't called chefs, we were called cooks, although we did the same. And I was in the class with 18 boys, and I went to that college for 5 years, 1 day a week, and had to make sure I was as good as the boys. And the chef used to write the menu up on the board in French, and before you could even cook in, you had to translate it. And I was very lucky to be with a boy who, him and I really hit it off. He came from Stirling and worked at the Golden Lion Hotel in Stirling, and he was great because he was very talented. And him and I worked together those 5 years, and he would give me all the tips And he now lives in America, and he's retired now, but he was an executive chef in a university in America. And he also worked in Jamaica at one time. So he ended up travelling the world a bit. We kept close contact, we still do. But the thing about it was two different styles of cooking. And because I was doing mince and tatties and school dinners, and they were doing this very elaborate, I was learning and learnt very quickly and knew I had to do it. And then I became top of the class. And that led me to lots of other avenues of cooking and doing events and doing weddings and christening. So apart from working in schools, I used to then do a function. And of course, it broadened my horizons. And I did work in hotels when it was school holidays. And I did silver service waitressing, and I did in hotels chambermaid. I've been laundry maid, because they didn't employ women as chefs. In the hotels, men were chefs and women were cooks. And the women usually were left to clean up and do the pots now. And so you didn't really learn a lot from hotels until I went to the Gaelic Hotel in Rossshire. And the chef there, it was a 5-star hotel, and the chef, I went to work for a season, and the chef there was absolutely awful. And I ended up with severe food poisoning. And they were going to take me by helicopter to the hospital. I was so bad. And they didn't want any of the people in the hotel to know I had food poisoning. So it was all hushed up. And I was given a wee cottage to stay in till I got better. And then when I did get better and I was starting to go back into the hotel being a laundry maid, one day the chef said, "Your lunch is in the fridge." And it was a pork pie and it was mouldy. And when I went to eat it, I thought, no, not again. And I got him in the local pub where he was playing darts, went mental, said to him, "Do you have?" And I rhymed off about 5 certificates. And he went, "No." I said, "Well, I have." And he went, "Oh." And the manager's wife said, "Come to my house. I'm doing a dinner party. I want you to come and help me." And then they made me the head chef.
Oh, that was quite something, wasn't it?
I was 24, I think, at the time, because they knew I knew what I was talking about. And that was a great job, because all the money that I earned, I wasn't spending. They were very good to me. They gave me this cottage that I stayed in, and they also, now and again, not that I drink now, but I used to drink a wee gin, so I used to get a bottle of gin every so often. And they kept me there, and they didn't want me to go. And every time I would say, "I'm going to visit my family in Glasgow," no, stay here. And eventually I got homesick and decided I wanted to go. I worked there for a couple of years. And of course, the first thing I did when I went back to Glasgow, I went back into school dinners. So...
Was that not strange?
It was very strange. And it wasn't as well paid. But having said that, it was a place I felt quite secure and comfortable in, and knew I could do the job, and went to be a supervisor again. And then I decided, I'd been in Edinburgh when I was 21, and I came back to Edinburgh, got a flat, and ended up coming to school dinners here and became a supervisor in school dinners.
But when you went back to Glasgow from Gairloch, was it?
Gairloch and Rossshire.
Did you live in the family home again then?
Yes, it was awful.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, because I'd grown away from that. It was round about that time, actually, my father was killed. But I had come back to Edinburgh, actually, and then in Glasgow. But the truth of the matter was, it's funny, when you leave home, you don't want to go back and stay at home because you miss the freedom. And not that I was ever really restricted in that sense, but when I was in the hotel, my father used to write to me and say, in very short notes, "When are you coming home? Your mother misses you, and she misses your money." And of course, my mother would go, "Don't bother coming home."
So she sounds as though she never put any pressure on you.
Absolutely none. No, absolutely none. But she was always very encouraging, and despite father was the opposite, he wasn't a bad man. No. He was just misguided in how to treat, especially women. Because his very words to me is, "You don't need to learn to cook. You don't need to do this. Your mother does this." And I went, "Yeah, right." And then he would say, "You just need to grow up and get married and have children." No way was I going to grow up.
Interesting. Could he cook at all, your father?
Yeah, he wasn't a bad cook, but he liked his meals.
No.
So on a Sunday dinner in our house, my mother would make a big pot of soup, roast beef, the whole trimmings, and he would get his roast beef and his dinner. And we would get, if my mother could afford that, a bit of roast beef. If she couldn't, sometimes you get things like spam and potatoes.
So he was up here in
Oh,
terms
yeah.
of...
Even his seat in his house, he would be watching TV and he had his chair angled at TV. And of course he watched sports. He liked football, Rangers supporter. He liked boxing. He was an amateur boxer for a wee while. And so it was always sport or music. But the thing was, in his eyes, women just didn't have to be educated. And he kind of resented it a bit, despite the fact I was doing quite well.
Yeah.
My mother would continually encourage me and continually say to him, no, she's doing well, leave her alone. But there was always this sort of friction. And then at one point, my friend that I was at college with, he was selling his car. And it was a big, the old Ford Consols.
Oh, yeah.
And I couldn't drive, but I wanted to drive. So he sold me his car for something like 50 quid or something, drove it to my house, and we lived in a 6 in a block in Castlemilk, and parked it outside the house. My father came home from work and he went, who the hell does that belong to? And of course me very proudly said, me, get it off the street. Women don't drive. And so I had my uncle to take the car round to my aunt's house who lived around the corner and park it there. And I was determined. I think the thing about my father, if I was being honest, he gave me the motivation to keep doing and succeeding.
Yeah.
My mother gave me the encouragement to keep going and succeeding. So despite the fact he said women don't drive, I was learning to drive. And despite the fact he said women don't get educated, I was getting educated. And I think through that attitude, that made me succeed later in life when I had my own business, etc. Yeah, it was fraught living at home. I still had all my brothers and sisters. I still had all of them. And I used to tell them stories. And my mother would say, take the kids to bed. And my sisters and that would say, tell me a story. And my sister still laughs to this day because I shared the bed with my sisters. My brothers was in another room. And when I would go in, we wouldn't have very much on the bed. And my sister called it duvets with arms, which was the coats would get thrown on top of the bed to keep us warm.
Yeah.
I remember we had the
Cold
duvets.
houses.
Yeah. And we had one pillow between the sisters. And when I get into bed and they would say, tell us a story, Jean, I would pull this pillow and to put my head in the pillow, and my sisters would try and pull it back. So we had this struggle going on. And to this day, I've still got a thing about pillows.
Have you? Do you have lots of pillows?
I have.
Your father different with the boys
Yes.
in the family? He was, yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah, my brother Bobby, who was a year and a half younger than me, he was the top man. And the thing that angered him, my father, was our head teacher, when I was leaving primary school to go to secondary school and going to this very good school, which had to get the uniform, had to travel by bus to, he was not pleased. And when my brother was leaving the following year, he was going to the local secondary school. And the head teacher made the mistake of saying to my dad, Geraldine is very clever and I would suspect she might go to university, etc. And Robert, my brother Bobby, Robert isn't as clever as Geraldine. And I was sitting reading a book. My father came into the house and he thumped me all over the house and said to me, who do you think you are? And that was the mentality of what his age group and men in Glasgow at that time, women get married and had lots of kids. That was what they were supposed to do. And anybody outside that was frowned upon. And in later life, I discovered that went rife through life, not just from my background, because when I moved to Edinburgh and I became catering manager at the Royal Bank of Scotland, I had a flat, I had a car, I had plenty of money. I went to buy a TV for my flat, and the guy said, oh, I went to rent the TV. In those days you could, and then buy it. And I said, I'd like to get that TV. The guy said, right, take that letter home and get your husband to sign for it. And I went, this was 1975. And I said, I don't have a husband, I'm not married. well, take it to your dad and get him to sign for it. And I said, sorry. I said, no, I didn't think he would sign for it anyway, so no. And then in the Royal Bank of Scotland, I was the manager and had a team below me. And then what happened was one of my cooks went off and I got a phone call. I worked for a company who was subcontracted. And they sent this young guy, and as soon as he arrived, I said, what's your name? And he said, Shammy. And I said, Shammy, you mean Sammy? And he went, no, Shammy. And I said, that's for cleaning windows. He says, yeah, I used to be a window cleaner. And I used to clean windows in a hotel, and I quite fancied being a chef. And I said, so are you a chef? And he says, well, aye. So he had this impression that he could just be a chef. And he burnt everything. He upset all the women. He had trails of flour and everything through the whole place. And eventually, after a couple of weeks, I thought the women were going to get rid of him. I didn't have the ability to sack him, which would not be nice, but I did phone my boss and said, could you take this young gentleman and move him somewhere else? And they said, yeah. And then that day he said, look, we normally send his pay slip through, and it was sealed. And they said, we'll not have time to do his pay slip. Give him the money out the till, pay him cash. And I said, how much have I to pay him? And it was twice as much as I was earning.
Just because he was a bloke?
And I was told, he's a man. And I said, what? And I said, but I'm the manager and I've got all the books and all the... And cook as well. He's a man. And that existed in 1975. And that existed through a good part of any job that I went for. No matter the training, no matter how good you might have been at a job, no matter how great your CV was, you were still a woman. And I think that's something that people don't realise, is that sort of mentality. My father's mentality was rife through Scotland because that was your role in life. It didn't daunt me. I just kept going.
Why did you come to Edinburgh?
Why? To get away from the kids. I had said to a friend of mine at the time, she had quite a good home life. And I used to go to her house and we'd play records and chat. And she was also a cook in the schools. And it turned out that I said, I'm going to leave. I want to travel the world because I like travelling. And I said, I'll find a job. And I found a job in the Old Waverley Hotel. And so my friend, who didn't need to leave home as urgently as I did, so at the age of 21, I went to work in the Old Waverley Hotel. And again, you were a cook, you were not the chef. And she came as well. And she was quite a character, typical Glaswegian fun. And we were living in a hotel, so that was your place to live, and you got your food, and you got your pay. So, good job. And when my friend came with me, she was going out with my partner from school, from college. So her and him were partners, and they were all in the pub one night. They get quite drunk, and they climbed up the fire escape, the two of them, bit of larking about. And I was in working that night for a function or whatever, and the housekeeper said, I've just found your friend climbing up the fire escape. And I went, all right. And she said, so I've sacked her. And I went, right, okay. And she says, but you can stay on. And I said, no, I'm sorry, if she's going, I'm going. And so, no job. And the two of us had to find a flat, which we stayed together for a while. And then from then I moved on and got other catering jobs. But that's why I came to Edinburgh, my first leg of my world tour. And I'm still here 50 years later.
But you have met George Bush on a cruise. So
I have. I've met a lot of famous people. I'm very lucky in that respect.
Very good.
After that first cruise, I've been going on cruises now for the past 9 years, always in Cunard. And the Queen Mary I've been on about 3 times. Been on a Queen Victoria, and I'm going on Queen Victoria next year to St Petersburg. I've been on the Queen Elizabeth. So I've travelled the Med, I've been to Norway. But on every cruise, you always meet interesting people, sometimes famous people. And I've met quite a few famous people. And I get my photographs taken. And my nephew said to me one day, Aunt Jean, see all these famous people you've met. Can I get my photograph with you? And I went, of course. And then he said to me, do you only know famous people? And I said, no, I know you. And then he said, because we're getting to the stage, we think, who's that with Aunt Jean?
And of course you're going on cruises to defy your father still, aren't you?
Yes.
So, You came to Edinburgh. You got a flat with your pal. How long was it before you got back into dinner lady?
Almost immediately, because I knew that that was something I could do. And when I got a job in Edinburgh as a dinner lady, I was taken on as a cook. The funny story about being a dinner lady is, as I said, I was 14 when I was trained, and the college trained you how to make meals for four. And making these meals for four, when you were making apple tart, you got a plate. You did the pastry, you did the apples, cooked it in the plate, divided it into four. And every meal you made was for four. And when I was qualifying from the college, which was the school college, they then send you out to schools. And the very first place I get sent, I remember the tutor saying, you'll be going to Holyrood School, which was in the Gorbals in Glasgow. And I remember one of the others going, oh God, that's Hell's Kitchen. And I never realised what they meant, but by God I found out. Because instead of being, in those days they were building schools and then eventually building kitchens onto the schools. But they didn't have a lot of them. So I get sent to Holyrood, and it was a huge, long Nissen hut, corrugated roof, and there was bars on the window, no ventilation whatsoever. The floor was tar. There was cookers which were 6 feet tall, and I'm quite small, and then so there was 6 big cookers. Then along from that there would be steamers, 4 big steamers. Then along from that there would be 6 60-gallon boilers with steps leading up to the boilers, and you stirred anything in it with a paddle, like a boat paddle.
It's industrial, isn't it?
It was. And then further up the kitchen was the cold area where the back door was open to allow the veg and potatoes to come in, and there'd be a potato machine. The women would all be standing there with potatoes. And I arrived at this kitchen with my nice wee white apron, white shoes and frilly hat, and the women had been told that we were coming to train them how to cook. And they were standing there with, the cooks had white overalls, the kitchen assistants had green overalls, called green staff. They had rubber aprons, which were tied with string around their neck. They had steel toe-cap shoes, and they had turbans, you know, the old-fashioned turbans? Yeah. They had the turbans, and as soon as I walked in, they all looked at me and laughed and said, you've come here to teach us to cook? And I said, yes. And I said, well, you were not that presumptuous, so you, well, I'm here to learn. And the office was an office, and the lady who was the supervisor was a right wee gentle lady who'd went to Doe School, very nice and polite. And when I arrived, she said to me, right, you'll be in my office with me, and I'll be teaching you this. I went, right, okay. And the very first day she said, go into the storeroom and ask Big Sadie what you're doing today. So I went in, Big Sadie, looking back on it, probably was the build I am now, but I was a wee skinny 15-year-old. And I said, what am I doing today, Sadie? She went, oh, and having a right laugh, come with me. 2 big fryers, and the fryers were side by side. She says, you stand there and do not move. The men will bring over, so this was a central kitchen, and huge central kitchen. The men will bring you over the meat, and the women will bring you over the batter. And you will not move from here. And they gave you a big scoop thing that was called a spider. And I want you to stand here and not move. You're going to make 3,000 spam fritters. And I went, 3,000 spam fritters? But I only make meals for 4. And I stood there and I was crying, and the fat was bouncing out at me. I'm doing these spam fritters. The men would come with tins, and you put 30 in a tin. And they would take the tin away and put them in big thermal boxes that they called coffins. And they would take the tins away, and I was standing there burning myself and crying. And then at lunchtime I was so exhausted, I was sitting at the table having a lunch. And what was for my lunch? Spam fritters. And then I said, Sadie, what do I do this afternoon? Come with me. She took me up to the coldest part of the kitchen, and they arrived with great big baths. It took 4 of them to carry them, with strips of almost frozen meat, 3,000 beef olives. And you had to, they made stuffing. You had to get a bit of meat, put the stuffing in it, roll it up and tie wee bits of string to hold it together. And my hands were freezing and my whole body was sore. And I did 3,000 spam fritters in the morning, 3,000 beef olives in the afternoon. I wasn't the only one, there was others to help. And then I went home and I laid down in front of the fire and went to sleep. And my father came in from work and he kicked me with his foot and he went, get up, what are you doing? And I says, I'm really tired, I've been cooking all day. He said, your mother cooks all day and she's not lying in front of the fire. And I said, but I did 3,000 spam fritters this morning and 3,000 beef ovals this afternoon. And he said to my mother, what an imagination she's got. That was my training. And I worked there for a couple of years until I became a supervisor. And the stories I could tell you, the laughs that we had in there. And talking about music, the women at the back of the kitchen would sing, "When I'm calling you," and the women at the front, the cooks, would, "I will answer," and they did all this singing, and they would listen to the radio and sing songs, and that's what lifted. You would make steak pie. The pastry would have to go through the old-fashioned mangle. So 2 people would stand, one would go like that, one would go till the pastry became thin. The stew would be all made, and then they would put the pastry on, and to put them in the ovens, way above my head. When it's cold, you put them in the ovens, but when they're hot, you're taking them out above your head. The tar floor would melt, and the heat from the steamers would hit the roof, which was a low corrugated iron roof, and it'd come down like water, like rain. And hence the women had the rubber aprons, they'd swap them round their neck so that they wouldn't get soaked. And then the steamers would hit the roof. The boilers were 60 gallons, and you had soup in one boiler, custard in another boiler, and then you'd have meat cooking in another boiler, and you had salt and pepper in a box, and you get around, you salt and pepper the meat, and it came to salt and pepper the custard. Oh God! and what happened was the custard boiler was what they call a double boiler with a tap. And when they made custard, and this is how the lumpy custard came about, you made custard with dried milk. And you had to get the milk, and they would put water in the boiler, and you would stand with a whisk and try and whisk all the lumps out. And then they would add the sugar, and they would dissolve the custard. There was porters who would pour in to the boiler, and you stood with this paddle. Now, when you were on boiler duty, you had to do the custard and run and check the soup and run and check the meat or whatever. And this boiler you'd be backwards and forwards, trying not to make it lumpy. And then they would run the tap, and they would run them into tubs, and they would go into the vans to be taken off. But the thing about that too was that it used to burn, the boiler would burn, and these men would use like paint scrapers to scrape the boilers. And then one day the 2 porters said to me, "You better make these custards properly, because we're going to end up being there all day scraping the boiler to get ready for the next day." And one day I had this notion, and I always thinking ahead, and when the women made pastry, they would have margarine in margarine papers.
Of course.
And I said, "Go and get me the margarine papers." And I put the margarine round the boiler. And then I said, "We'll put the milk in, wait to make sure there's no lumps, but don't put the sugar in, because it's the sugar that burns. Dissolve the custard, put the custard in, and then at the last minute, put the sugar in, and it won't burn." And what happened was, when we did it that way, when they went to scrape it, it came off like a skin, all in the one. And the men were saying, "That was a great idea." So I became the custard queen. And they made me a crown and a lanyard, and I was the custard queen. So they didn't have lumpy custard. It was a heavy job.
So they were supplying, how many schools were they supplying?
Well, they would be supplying quite a lot of schools, because there would be vans draw up to the back door. They would take the coffins away, and then in the afternoon they'd come back with all the empty tins, and the women had to stand round the sinks, which were big deep sinks, and clean all the tins, and of course you ended up having to help them as well. So if you're doing 3,000 meals, and you imagine each school might have a couple of hundred kids in it, so there was maybe 10, 12, 15 schools.
You don't realise when you're in school. I remember I was in a very small primary school, the meals arriving in these trays and things. You don't associate it all done
Where it came from.
Yeah, it's industrial.
Yeah, it is industrial scale. And the supervisor, she was a lovely lady, but very much a lady. And there was a heart of the Gorbals, and the women were all rough and ready. And there was like, in those days, 3 people called Betty and 2 people called Margaret, and they all had the same name. And when I started, of course, I was a Jean. There might have been another Jean there. And I remember one lady, when I was asking them all what your name is, this one woman said to me, "I'm Bella Feroce." And I went, "Oh," and she did look kind of Italian looking. And I went, "Right, okay." So for a good while I kept saying, "Mrs. Feroce, is it okay if I do this?" Or "Mrs. Feroce." And one day she went, "Why are you calling me Mrs. Feroce?" I said, "Because you said that was your name." She went, "No, I'm Bella from Rossi." So we had lots of laughs, and then, and for all they were rough, and for all it was a hard job, and it was Hell's Kitchen. And when it came to the holidays time, I remember they all chipped in, and my wages then was £4 4 and 4pence. I remember it, £4 4 and 4pence, and they all gathered money, and they gave me an envelope, and in the envelope was like £20, which was a lot of money. And I said, they had all chipped in and said, "That's your fare," and it was a Glasgow fare. And I said, where am I going? I thought they wanted me to go. I went, no, that's for your holiday, that's for your fare. So that was the nature of them, you know, and they were quite rough and tough. And Miss Just, who was the wee supervisor, said to me one day, "Go up the kitchen." By this time they were clearing up, and they used to have to clean everything, of course, because we get inspected by environmental health and so on. Go up the kitchen and tell the girls to do another bag of potatoes, which is like £56. And when I went up and I said, Miss Just said you have to do another bag of potatoes. One woman who, Big May, she was as tough as nails, "Go back and tell her to F off." And I said, "Oh," and I'm running back the kitchen. I said, "They're rather busy just now. They'll do it tomorrow." And she went, "Go back and tell them they need to do it tonight." And I would go back and say, "They have to do it," and they would go, "We're not doing it." And I go, "God." And then some of them would take pity on me and say, "Just do them. It's not her fault. She's just told."
So the go-between.
I was a go-between, and so I was a go-between. And Miss Just, occasionally, when she got a bit upset, there was a walk-in cupboard behind us. She would drive in the cupboard, shut the door, and say, "Deal with that." I'm like, "Right, okay. What do I do?" You know, but so it was rough, but they were kind, and they were hard-working, and they worked 7 days a week, from 7 in the morning till about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because children get school dinners on a Saturday then. And eventually they did move me up to Winlow, where my brothers and sisters were. 100%. And I was a cook there, and my brothers and sisters were coming up, you know, for their lunch and going, "Can we get an extra bit of cake?" No. So
no favouritism.
No. So they moved then into a smaller kitchen, and eventually when I was 19, I became a supervisor, and they gave me a lovely kitchen beside the local crematorium. And I was in the kitchen, and I was supervisor by this time. The women were maybe in their 40s and 50s, and I was still a lot of amusement about me being so young and so small. And one day one of the women said to my father and mother ended up being in that crematorium, and recently my niece, and it was near where I stayed. So you'd walk to work a couple of miles, get to the wee school, and it was very nice, lovely, all new stuff. And one day one of the women said to me, which had started, and I could smell wood burning. And I went, "I can smell wood burning." And a couple of women said, "Yeah, it's a crematorium." And I went, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, well, when it's a crematorium and the boxes are getting burnt, you'll smell it." And I went, "That would be awful." And eventually one of the women said, "Come over here." And they had a wooden cutlery box. Somebody had left it on the gas, and it was that was burning.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Life Story. Thelma Podcast also have other channels that showcase memories and stories we have collected over the years. The Thelma Tapes, short podcasts built around a theme, such as pets from the past, sweeties, car memories, sporting heroes and Hogmanay. There is also Leith Lives, growing up, living and working in Leith. There's also music, forgotten songs from the broom cupboard, obscure and forgotten music and songs played from old 78 RPM records. Analog Rory's Tuesday Blues, a trawl through lesser-known blues music from an extensive vinyl record collection. Links to all these channels can be found on our website www.livingmemory.org.uk or are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer and Google Play Music. We also have our wee Museum of Memory at Ocean Terminal Shopping Centre, Level 2 next to Britannia, and we are open 10:30 until 4 p.m, 7 days a week. Why not come in and have a look round our huge collection and share some memories? You might end up in our recording studio and actually on one of these podcasts. Thanks again.